Hello, I'm Ollie. This is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, it's none of the above really, so I was going to talk a little bit about All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy, the first book in his Border trilogy. So this is one of those books I've been meaning to read for years. I remember when I was in my early 20s, a really good friend of mine at university read it and absolutely raved about it. She just went on and on about how great it was. So it's kind of been stuck in the back of my mind since then. But I just never got round to reading it. And then a while ago, I bought a Mac Bolan book from an eBay seller, and they sent me the wrong one. So I sent feedback back to them. And they said I could pick any other book, from their library of books on eBay. It was a similar price to take, and they had this, the Border trilogy. So I picked that and started reading All the Pretty Horses a couple of days ago. It took me 2 or 3 days to read, and I had a lot of thoughts on finishing it, and partly that's because there was a video I'd been meaning to do about bad reading habits, which the ideas around it had never really crystallised in my mind enough for me to make the video. But reading All the Pretty Horses really helped me in terms of getting my mind straight about my bad reading habits. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book first, then I'll talk about the bad reading habit, and then I'll tie the two together. So I think lots of people have read this book and lots of people really, really like it. Obviously not everyone does, but I know it's, a popular book, and looking on Goodreads, it's got, many, many 5-star reviews, including from people whose opinions I definitely respect. What it's about is a young guy, so a young man, I can't remember if he's late teens or early 20s, but, a young guy. And I think it's not entirely clear. It wasn't entirely clear to me when it was set, but I think it's like around the 50s or 60s. So he's in America, and I can't remember what state he's in. I think it's probably Texas, but it's a state like Texas anyway, if it isn't Texas. And he leaves home for various reasons. His parents are split up, and there's a acrimonious battle going on between them. Anyway, he leaves home and kind of, with a friend of his, just rides off on, into the sunset in true kind of cliched Western fashion, just to start a new life, really. And the book is about the two of them and a guy that they meet, travelling across the American landscape, and eventually him meeting this girl and falling in love with her, and all sorts of stuff going on. And there's some fairly grueling scenes in it. There's some prison scenes which are fairly intense, and there's a lot of drama and things like that in the book. And but it ended up, to me, feeling like, to be honest with you, a bit of waste of time. So plot wise, it reminded me a lot, and indeed, to some extent, the writing style reminded me of Elmore Leonard, who's a writer I really like. So Leonard is, very famous nowadays as a writer of crime stories. Obviously, sadly passed away a few years ago, but very famous as a crime author, but started out writing westerns. And there's a lot about All the Pretty Horses that reminded me of Elmore Leonard. So it's quite a male story, which Leonard's stuff tends to be, and also it's very dialogue heavy. So there's long sections in this that are literally just two people talking to each other without even any narrative around that, just the dialogue. And that's something Leonard tends to do as well in his crime novels particularly. And that's something typically I like. I really like dialogue in books. I'm a huge fan of Ed McBain, who often has big passages of dialogue like that in his books, just the back and fro of conversation. So it's something I really like. Now, Leonard is, as well as being famous, as a great writer, is also famous for his 10 rules of writing. All the Pretty Horses, as I've said, did remind me of Elmore Leonard, plot-wise, and in some degree the writing as well. But I think it breaks two of Elmore Leonard's rules. So I think his overarching rule of writing is that if it sounds like writing, write it again. And I think All the Pretty Horses sounds like writing. And it's even worse than that in a way. It sounds like writing that's designed not to sound like writing, but it really sounds like writing to me. He has this terrible habit of writing just really long sentences that are, you know, so and so did something, and then they did this, and then they did that, and then they did the other. I can probably open the book at any point. I'm going to say that and see if I can do that or not. But yeah, so here we go. So I've literally opened it at this page, and this is a single sentence. But nothing else matched, and no such horse ever was that he had seen. And he'd once asked his grandfather what kind of horses they were, and his grandfather looked up from his plate at the painting as if he'd never seen it before, and he said, "Those are picture book horses," and went on eating. So it sounds like I think it's written to be to feel like a stripped down simple sentence, but actually it's overly complicated. And I just found that constant repetition of and you know, it's almost like he's just listing things that happen rather than describing things that happen. I just found that very frustrating. So one of Leonard's other rules is read out the parts that readers tend to skip. And for me, this book is full of bits that almost encourage you to skip. So two things. So firstly, that listing thing. So that and particularly where he's just describing inconsequential things that happen. So, you know, he's saying, you know, so it will be like, so say he was describing someone making a cup of tea. Yeah. So, you know, a writer who was truly stripped down would say they made a cup of tea. Yeah. But he would say, you know, Cormac McCarthy would say, he drew some water and poured it into the kettle, and then he boiled the kettle, and then he got a mug out of the cupboard and he put a tea bag in the mug, and then he poured the boiling water from the kettle into the mug. Maybe a full stop there. He left the tea to brew for 5 minutes, and then he fished the tea bag out of the mug, and then he added some milk to that. No, sorry, and then he opened the fridge and took some milk from the fridge, and he poured the milk into the tea. You know, it will be like that. Whereas actually, all you need to know is he made a cup of tea. The rest of it is just waffle. And you know, so All the Pretty Horses is a 300-page book. It could have been a 150-page book. If Elmore Leonard had written it, it would have been a 150-page book, and it would have been much better. So I found when I was reading these long descriptive sentences that go nowhere, I was subconsciously skipping them. I was unable to read them because they were just too long and too boring, and my mind would skip them. And then the other thing he does, which I guess I can kind of understand why he's done this, because this book is, you know, it's set in a part of America where Spanish is spoken often, and indeed it ends up being in Mexico. You know, there's long portions of it in Mexico where obviously Spanish is spoken, but there are long bits of dialogue in this book which are entirely in Spanish. So, you know, you will have a to and fro conversation of 3-4 things, all in Spanish. Now, that's fine if you read Spanish. I don't read Spanish. I could, every time that happened, have got my phone out and Googled what was being said, but I didn't. And I don't think that Cormac McCarthy really expects you to do that. He might expect some of his readers to have, you know, enough knowledge of Spanish, or very good knowledge of Spanish, to be able to understand those passages. But I don't think it's reasonable for him to think that all of his readers will speak Spanish. So that either does, so including these Spanish bits, either it does one of two things. It either forces you as a reader, if you want to understand what's happening, to go and look it up, which immediately takes, you know, literally takes you out of the book, or it encourages you to skip. Because as soon as I got to one of these bits where there was a Spanish conversation, I just looked down, you know, I just scanned down the page to find the bit where it started being in English again. So both the listing of things in sentences and the inclusion of Spanish dialogue forced me or encouraged me to skip. And what that made me feel was that actually, you know, if I could skip those bits and not lose anything of the story, maybe I could skip other bits as well. And I think that ended up with me subconsciously, without even realising it, skipping bits. Yeah, skipping bits that Cormac McCarthy didn't want me to skip when he was writing the book, because he was forcing me to skip these other bits. And that comes back to my reading bad habit. So my reading bad habit is I will be reading a book and the book won't be gripping me enough, and therefore I won't be paying enough attention to the book. And I will go for, you know, a couple of chapters like that. And then I'll get to the point where actually I don't really know what's going on. And it becomes like a vicious cycle, because I don't pay enough attention to the book because it's not gripping me. So I read I read a section of it without it really sinking in properly. And then I don't understand what's going on even more. So I become less and less invested in the book as I go. And I often end up, I'm terrible at DNFing books, in that I'm very reluctant to DNF a book. And that's another bad habit, and one I'll probably talk about in another video. But what that means is I end up not finishing, or I end up finishing the book without really having appreciated it, because I've switched off to it at some point during the book, and that switching off that partial switching off has snowballed into a complete switching off, so that I'm sitting there and the words are going into my eyes, but they're not really going into my brain. And I think, this book really helped me to, crystallise my thoughts about that, because I realised that the book was actively encouraging me not to pay attention to it by including bits where I felt there was no value to me in reading them, because A, I don't speak Spanish, and B, he was describing, in very granular detail, things that I just had no relevance really to the story at all. So I ended up finishing this book, not the whole book. So sorry, what I should have said is, so All the Pretty Horses is the first of three. So the first of the three books in the Border trilogy, and this volume has all three of them. So I ended up finishing it, knowing what happened in the book, but just not having connected with the characters at all. And I think part of that is down to my that bad habit which the book encouraged in me, but also it felt like the book felt very superficial in some ways, in that, because as I've said, he tends to describe events rather than or list things that are happening rather than really describing what's happening, and rather than talking about the characters' emotions. I had no emotional connection with the characters in this book at all. I couldn't have cared less what happened to them. And some pretty horrific things happened in the book, but they left me completely unmoved, because I just really wasn't bothered. And when I compare it to, something like, I'm thinking of a book that had a massive impact on me. So A Little Life, which I read earlier this year, where it's much less dramatic in terms of what happens in the book, although it's fairly dramatic, but it's less dramatic than this. But I had just no, compared to A Little Life, where, something very small happening could have a big emotional impact on me. In this, something very big happening had no emotional impact, because I just couldn't care less about the characters. And I think what you've ended up with here is a book where it feels like, in the storyline, with the the kind of cowboy element to it, or the Western element to it, and prison scenes and villains and all that kind of thing, it feels like he's trying to almost pay homage to Westerns, to a kind of Elmore Leonard type Western, but because his writing style is so in your face with this listing and the use of Spanish and other things as well, the writing gets in the way of the story. And so I think if exactly the same story had been written in a truly simple style rather than what he thinks is a simple style, I think I would have connected with it much more. But in fact, completely contrary to Elmore Leonard's rules of writing, the writing in this book just gets in the way of everything. Gets in the way of the story, gets in the way of the characters, and gets in the way of the readers, or certainly me as a reader. It got in the way of my enjoyment of the book. So that's my thoughts on All the Pretty Horses. And I have to say, I also read I've also read The Road. That's the only other Cormac McCarthy book that I've read. And I really enjoyed The Road. I mean, enjoyed's the wrong word. I thought The Road was a very good book. So I may, I may try the other two novels in this volume. And I've got a couple of things by him on my Kindle as well, I think. I may give them a try, but I have to say All the Pretty Horses has really turned me off to him as a writer. I was quite excited to read it because I like The Road, but it really left me completely cold. Yeah, so that's my thoughts on the book. I know lots of people like it, so if you violently disagree with what I've said, feel free to comment, as always. But yeah, hope you found the video interesting anyway. Hope you're all having a good week. Hope you've enjoyed Christmas if you celebrate Christmas. And I will speak to you again soon. Cheerio.